Hey everyone, welcome back to the Wisdom Tradition Podcast. Once again, this is Alex Sakin, and today I am excited to be presenting the sixth and concluding article in our ongoing series on the topic of the philosophy of meditation and the use of mandalas and the symbolism that's inherent to mandala design and the psychological concepts involved, such as those involving archetypes. These are all things that we've been focusing on over the course of this series. And in the course of discussing these topics, we've been revisiting Mahayana Buddhism and Pythagorean philosophy as a means to delve further into these topics and to provide a sort of case study by which we can understand how these things all come together. And so in this article, the sixth and concluding part of this series, we're going to be investigating world civilization as a mandala. In other words, we'll be looking at the human soul in the collective sense and looking at how this collective soul of man itself impresses itself in the form of a mandala upon earth. And so the form of man, which is civilization, is itself a mandala in the same way that on a microcosmic scale, the human anatomy is a type of mandala. And the human anatomy evidences the metaphysical principles that vivify the body. Those principles are reflected within the structure of the body. And so moving now over to the macrocosm, we can see the same dynamic taking place in which the total of civilization exists as a type of grand man or a grand human form. And so we're going to be investigating that today. And in so doing, we're going to draw on a few concepts from the previous articles in the series, many of them from Pythagorean philosophy, but also some of them from Mahayana Buddhism. So I hope you'll stick around for this episode. It's a long one. The article is a substantial one, but I make a lot of important points here that are going to set the stage for the future articles to come in the future chapters of this book. Again, this article, this chapter is part of a larger book called Philosophy, Its Origin, Purpose, and Destiny. And so the past several chapters, we've been really going deep into the philosophy and the substance of the philosophy of these ancient traditions. And then in the beginning of the book, we looked more at the origins of the history of this tradition of philosophy and esoteric philosophy. And now in these later chapters, we're going to be understanding how this tradition has actually shaped the world in a way, in the modern world, in the formation of the modern world. So we're going to understand our society today now using the lens of esoteric philosophy that we've developed over the course of this book and using the lens of the historical framework we've been developing. We're going to put those into practice and then try to understand today and the sort of past century in particular. We're going to try to understand these relevant aspects of our history, and we're going to try to reframe them using esoteric philosophy. And so this article today is sort of the bridge that unites everything that's come before in this book project with everything that's to follow. So everything that's come before is sort of setting the stage for what we're going to be talking about today. We're going to be synthesizing a lot of material, and then the conclusions that we draw in this article are going to set the stage for everything else that is to follow. And to give you a little bit of a preview, the next chapter I'm going to be jumping into after this one is done is on the topic of Plato and his vision of the Philosophic Empire and his teachings about the role that philosophy must play in building a stable world civilization. And a true democracy requires philosophy. So these are things that we're going to be discussing in the next article. This is a type of social vision that we're going to be laying out, rooted in Plato's teachings and, of course, Manly Hall's interpretation of Plato's teachings. And then the chapter after that is on Francis Bacon, and we're going to be going into the history of basically, we're going to be condensing like 1,500 years of history in the course of that article, and we're going to be talking about how Francis Bacon really sets the stage for the modern world and the scientific age. And then part of that discussion of Francis Bacon is his involvement in the American colonization scheme. And so that's going to then set the stage for the next article, which is on the history of America. And I'm going to bring that up to date, up to sort of a more modern times, and discuss some very important elements of American history that a lot of people miss. And the method I'm going to use to discuss these aspects of American history is going to be drawn from the topics that we're talking about today, which is this idea of society organized as a caste system, and how this idea of the caste system integrates into this larger archetypal framework of the collective human soul. And we're going to be just exploring how the Tetractys is actually a mandala of how this soul works. And the Tetractys reveals the proper place of this caste system within the larger spiritual framework that Pythagoras and Buddha all talk about. So anyway, that's coming up in the chapter on America. And then after that, I have a chapter on Manly Hall. And I'm going to be using Manly Hall as a means to talk about things that happened in the 20th century, particularly around World War II, and how those things set the stage for everything that is to come, or that has come since then. And we're going to be looking at the specific role that Manly Hall and the sort of esoteric world played in World War II, and sort of we're going to speculate at what those esoteric societies, what sort of vehicle they're operating through today, and that's going to come as part of that chapter on Manly Hall. And then the final chapter is a type of retrospective on the whole book that's done through the language of astrology, particularly the teachings about the great year and the motion of the sun through the great year. So that is going to finish off the book. So again, those discussions are all going to really be rooted in this article that we're going to be talking about today. It's a major transition point in this book. And so I hope you'll stick around for this episode and pay close attention. And also check out the article. Like all my articles, this one has a lot of images that are relevant to the topics we're discussing. And so I hope you'll check it out. And before I get into part one of this current article, I want to point out that in the written article, I have as a preface a quote from Manly Hall featured, or prominently featured. And I want to read that to you before we begin. And this is a quote that was originally taken from one of his works when he was describing the mandalas, the two Buddhist mandalas that I went over in part 4 of this series. And if you'll remember, the centerpiece of those mandalas is the Buddha Mahavairocana, who is the supreme Buddha of those mandalas, and that represents the divine self. So in this quote, he's going to reference this Mahavairocana figure in the form of its alternate name, Dainichi Nori. So he writes, quote, "In the radiant nature of Dainichi Nori, all things are forever one. Unity is reality. Diversity is an illusion. And upon this mental self-defeat, we have built a world of pain. In the mortal world, there is competition. In the world of the soul, there is cooperation. Therefore, by correcting our own perspective, we restore the grandeur of the infinite plan." That's Manly Hall. And that is going to basically thematically preview what we're going to be discussing in this article. So we'll be beginning with part 1. That's going to be called The Tetractys as a Mandala of the Human Soul. And that's coming right up. All right, before beginning this section, I just want to point out that I have a cool diagram at the heading of the written version. So go check that out if you haven't yet. It's on my Substack, thewisdomtradition.substack.com. And you can find a link on my website, www.alexsakin.com. All right, so let's get started with the article. And again, this first section is titled The Tetractys as a Mandala of the Human Soul. So remember, in our previous article, we looked at the Tetractys as a mandala of first cause and also of the world soul, or the monad. And so today we're going to be looking at the Tetractys as a mandala of the microcosm, as a sort of another type of monad, but on a microcosmic level. And that microcosm is humanity as a whole. So humanity exists as an aspect of the world soul, and humanity is a microcosm of this world soul. It's a concentrated seed image of the world soul as a whole that exists within the soul itself. So let's begin. In the previous section of the 6-part series, of which this current article is the 6th and concluding part, we discussed how the world soul, manifesting through creation, organizes itself according to the archetypal design pattern of the Tetractys. To be more specific, life on Earth exists as the internal expression of a greater solar life. As Manly Hall explains, the Earth itself is considered a microcosm or miniature of the total cosmic scheme. Symbolically, the greater solar life that contains the Earth sphere is represented by the three outer points of the Tetractys, within which an internal septenary of soul powers is made manifest. Earth is the sphere of material form within which these seven soul powers are brought into active material manifestation. This septenary manifests as the 7 ages of Earth, the 7 continents, the 7 root races or evolutionary forms of the human species, and the 7 kingdoms of nature, of which the outer body of evolving humanity is the 4th kingdom, and the adept hierarchy of the mystery schools is the 5th. And we're going to be unpacking that statement more as we go. So continuing, according to the famous esoteric teaching of the macrocosm and microcosm, as above, so below, mankind, meaning the human soul in both its individual and collective aspects, neither being separate from the other, is designed as a miniature or microcosm of the world soul as a whole. Being a microcosm of the whole, we may deduce that, just as the world is innately designed according to a septenary pattern, mankind is also internally organized in the form of a septenary. In terms of human evolution, this septenary manifests primarily as the 7 root races of man, which exist across the 7 evolutionary ages of Earth. Each of these root races, and the word root races is an old theosophical term, each of these root races represents an evolutionary form of the human. Each form is adapted to the state of the world system existing during the world age it is occupying. In the esoteric teachings, we are currently in the 5th age of the 7-age cycle taking place in the world soul. This implies that humanity is currently expressing itself according to the design of the 5th root race. In ancient Sanskrit, the name for this age is termed the Arya, and the root race associated with it, the Aryan. For more on the 7 ages and 7 root races, see my 2021 publication, Atlantis and the Origins of Civilization. See also several episodes of related content on my podcast titled The Wisdom Tradition. Specifically, the Sanskrit word Aryan represents a primordial caste of ancient North Asian Brahmins, or masters of esoteric knowledge, who were first initiated into the doctrine of knowledge they became masters of by a line of bodhisattvas or rishis, who themselves are the 7 outer extensions of a cumulative human entity or human Buddha, termed the Manushi Buddha, or the Manu, who himself is the seed image of the Vajrasattva or world soul as a whole. So that's a lot to unpack. So the human Buddha or the Manu is the parent of 7 bodhisattvas, and those 7 bodhisattvas raised the first line of, you could say, adepts and initiates and founded the first schools. And so those first humans who were raised by the bodhisattvas to embody the ideal of the adept, who were sort of initiated and awakened as humans, those first cohort of leaders were termed the Aryans, or the Arya. So the Arya means the noble, and specifically it refers to this original caste of teachers. And so the migrations of this caste of teachers is what catalyzes the spread of this doctrine of teachings around the world. And in the various cultures it encounters, it adapts its doctrine of teachings to that culture and remixes it, and redesigns it, and it becomes an expression of this one common system, this one common wisdom tradition. And so in the case of Greece, this motion coming in is what originally founded the Orphic tradition, coming in around 1400 BC, and then, give or take, and then later Pythagoras can also be seen as somebody who was as an initiate, was brought into this caste, this Brahmanic caste, or this Aryan caste. And so he was an ambassador for these teachings within Greece almost 1,000 years after the Orphic tradition. Plato was as well. Now, if you go over to the Buddhist tradition, you can look at Gautama Buddha as being somebody who was a representation of this Aryan dissemination from North Asia, from North India, Tibet, the Himalayas. And so that's where the origins of things begin in terms of this revelation, these original descent of these rishis and the first raising of the Aryan Brahmins. They were associated with this North Asian descent of tradition. And so from this North Asian plateau, gradually this caste of teachers would be sent on sort of missions and migrations around the world to gradually reform civilization into a pattern that would become a representation of this body of wisdom teachings that originally, again, begin in this North Indian region. So that's the cycle of the Arya that the early chapters of this book were dedicated to. We discussed this process. And I also have another publication that I did last year called Atlantis and the Origins of Civilization that also discusses this pattern of the Arya and its relationship to what came before, which is associated with Atlantis. So anyway, those things were all discussed in those in that publication and in the podcast I did around that publication. So returning now and considering the relationship now between the idea that the collective human soul and the world soul exist as a type of microcosm, macrocosm. By implication, quote, the universe was a vast person and the human being was a tiny universe. In both cases, the world soul and the human soul, each is designed according to the archetype of the Tetractys. This means that just as the world soul exists as the internal manifestation of a great monad or divine self, so the collective human soul also exists as the internal meditation of a supreme meditating Buddha, a human Buddha, the Manu. This pattern is in turn repeated for each individual human soul or sattva. It exists as a monad over top a hierarchy of inner parts. So the monad is an archetypal role position, I guess you could say. It's the role of the whole over parts. So humanity is a monad in the sense that it's a whole existing over top parts, and the world soul is also a monad. But then each individual human sattva or principle of the self is a monad in terms of the string of hundreds of extensions of personalities of human life forms it has extended from itself. So it's the one whole over which all those parts have been extended. And so it's the container of all of those various lifetimes. So you can see the pattern repeats on this type of fractal level. So in the case of the human or the sattva, the monad or seed self manifests its powers and potentials through the individualized vehicle of a physical human personality, which is born within the womb of this monad or soul or self through an internal process of division, just like how in cell creation, cell multiplication takes place within the body of the original cell or monad of the organism. The supreme unity or monad of all is God. Man, made in the image of God, is patterned after the same design pattern or archetype that God is. This archetypal design pattern is what the Tetractys mandala is attempting to describe. The world soul and the human soul are both structured according to a common design archetype. The Pythagoreans called this archetype the monad and depicted it through their mandala of the Tetractys. Modern system scientists are rediscovering this archetype in the form of the system, with the universe being a grand super system that embeds an integrated hierarchy of lesser systems within itself, each designed as a miniature microcosm or monad of the whole. Thus, the design of diversity suspended from unity is an invariable pattern throughout creation. Each item of diversity becomes in its own nature a unity, from which is further suspended another host of diversity, and so on ad infinitum. That's a Manly Hall quote. Another quote. The parts can have but a fractional share of the attributes of the whole, but the whole partakes of the attributes of the parts in fullness and perfect harmony. Hence, the whole is the master of its parts, which must bow before its dictum and are powerless to force their fragmentary agencies upon the structure of wholeness itself. So this idea of part and whole is inherent to this idea of the Tetractys, and the parts are all subservient to the monad, which is the single dot at the apex of the pyramid. And that represents the self. the self overtop the parts. And that self, that monad, the way it works is that monad is in turn part of a larger self. So it's a dot within a larger circle. And then that larger circle is itself a dot within a yet larger circle. So that's how it works, this upward motion of unities within unities. In systems terms, this means that the world and man are both patterned after the system archetype. The system archetype states that one supersystem embeds and contains a hierarchy of lesser systems within itself. Each system within the supersystem is a miniature or microcosm of the whole. Each functions as a lesser wholeness or monad within which an internal hierarchy of parts are embedded. This is true of the galaxy, it is true of the solar system, it is true of our world system, and it is true of mankind on both an individual level and a collective level. So it's an archetype. It's a pattern stamped upon the face of creation. And the archetype is one of wholeness and parts being embedded within a whole. So it's simple. That's what a system is. All right, so that's the end of that section. That was the first part of the chapter. So next we're going to be looking at part 2 of this article. It's called the Manu, the monad of collective humanity. This is something that we introduced in this section just now, the idea of the Manu, or the human Buddha, or the Manushi Buddha, this idea of a collective human self, one self behind all selves. So that's what's coming up next. Mankind exists as an integral part of the great supersystemic wholeness it is embedded within, this being the world soul. The human soul plays a special role within the world soul. It is designed as a lesser microcosm or monad of it, meaning it functions as a miniature supersystem in which one archetypal wholeness, or one self, manifests its being through an inner hierarchy of lesser subsidiary parts and extensions. The monad or spiritual apex of the human soul is the Manu, or Manushi Buddha, which again is like the human Buddha, or the human divine self. So there are 7 rays cast forth from this divine human self, and these become the 7 rishis or bodhisattvas that emerge as his external mind powers, and which together work to reveal and fulfill the dharma or doctrine on his behalf. This human Buddha, termed simply the Manu in ancient Hindu philosophy, is the original cell within which all subsequent human division has taken place. Manly Hall explains that, quote, wholeness is an archetypal quality, an attribute of deity. This wholeness is made manifest by a division within itself, whereby its nature becomes a mass of innumerable fragments, each partaking of the quality resident in the original wholeness. In human life, this wholeness is the human Buddha or Manu, and each of us is a cell located within the inner structure of its being. At the culmination of all human enlightenment, it will be this great human Buddha who will come to an ultimate realization of his own supreme consciousness, for his is the one great self-consciousness behind all individual experiences of self-consciousness that have ever taken place here on earth. In the teaching of the Jewish Kabbalah, itself derived from the ancient Egyptian esoteric teachings, this human monad is termed Adam Kadma. Manly Hall explains that Adam Kadma is actually the monad of mankind. Human beings, therefore, derive their human qualities from their participation in the nature of this prototypic monad. Thus, from the Adamic monad are suspended the billions of individualized men and women who, when considered as a unity, constitute a single creature. The first and supreme man, the idea of mankind, the Adamic unity. That's a Manly Hall quote. The monad is, quote, that unity, that oversoul within which every man's particular being is contained and made one with all others. This oversoul, the anthropoid, is the common father of infinite progeny. It alone is man, for men are but fractional parts of themselves and are never complete until all together they form one grand nature. This idea of a human monad or human Buddha represents a Platonic idea of humanity, the archetype or pattern of the genus Homo. Each human exists as a downward reflection of this singular archetype. Its singular image is reflected into the material universe as a multitude of ensouled human organisms. Thus, quote, mankind may be considered as a vast organism with one spirit or self, manifesting through an infinite number of intellectual and physical organisms. By implication, then, quote, no one has a consciousness higher than any other, for there is one consciousness in the universe. He who is presumed to have a higher consciousness is simply one whose organisms are fine enough to manifest more completely the potentialities of this single consciousness. Originating as a focal point or seed of the world soul, the human monad or manu originally entered into an experience of diversity within itself by meditation or through meditation. Situated above and beyond creation itself, quote, it contemplates the fact without becoming the fact, meaning it contemplates diversity, but it remains a unity. That which is this is a quoting Mendenhall, that which is the internal experience of the Manu becomes the external experience of the collective race, which has been conjured into existence by the Manu. In this way, the moods and thoughts of the meditating power appear as the social environments, political circumstances, and cultural attainments of the species. Gradually, as the meditation of this Manu moves, quote, from unity through diversity, a new kind of integration is established. This grand man, through the experience of living, exhausts all diversity of experience. When he experiences everything, he really experienced one thing, himself. And that is the end of that section. So again, that was called the Manu, the monad of collective humanity. So the monad of humanity can be modeled as a tetractys. So mankind is itself a tetractys, just as the world as a whole is a tetractys. So the next section is called the sattva, the monad of the human being. All right, so the sattva is the monad of the human being. I introduced this idea earlier, but again, doing this microcosm, macrocosm, as above, so below. If the collective humanity is a monad, then the individual human on a smaller scale is also a monad. And so the seat of life of each individual human is the sattva principle. So that becomes the monad that exists over top the lower bodily vehicle of the person. So the lower body and the psychic nature of the person, the psyche is an extension of this monad. So beginning, according to the Hermetic axiom, as above, so below, the archetypal dynamics that are to be found within the macrocosm or collective human monad as a whole should in turn also be found to be true of the individual human organism or microcosm. The pattern of correspondence that connects the two is based on the idea that behind the mass of all individual human lives is a single human self who is meditating the entire saga of human evolution into existence as an internal expression of his own consciousness. Each person's self or sattva principle is an internal expression of this divine man or human Buddha. This monad is the supersystemic entity within which each human life exists as a lesser, internally held subsystem. Ultimately, all individual human systems or monads will inevitably be absorbed back into the one monad, the supersystem, meaning that the one life will eventually consolidate all diversity back into itself such that only its own archetypal unity will remain. By implication, the highest spiritual aspect of each person is a seed or cell, i.e. a microcosm, contained within the superior being of this grand overself, the macrocosmic man. The divine human self remains throughout the cycle of creation outside the realm of corporeal limitation and, quote, broods over the incarnating parts, where from its own state of detachment, it contemplates the attachments which involve its inferior selves. Likewise, each individual sattva principle does the same. It remains throughout the cycle of creation in the, quote, Western paradise, or solar sphere, or heaven sphere, where it contemplates the attachments which involve the lower material personalities that it extends lifetime after lifetime from out of its own superior spiritual nature. Hall teaches that, quote, among the potentialities of the self is the power of projecting a host of individualities into temporary existence. After existing their appointed span, these individualities are reabsorbed into the self from whose essences they were originally differentiated. Thus, the self gives birth to an infinite number of personalities, but it is the self, not the personalities, that endures. This self does not actually incarnate or reincarnate, but from itself individualizes incarnating organisms. That's a Manly Hall quote. These incarnating organisms become the basis of a grand process of self-realization and internal enlightenment for the self, or for the sattva principle. Every sequence of events that the sattva sets into motion through its incarnating personalities is a revelation of universal processes. Thus, the sattva must experience the inevitable reactions of any action he vitalizes. This sattva principle, the parent of hundreds of incarnating personalities, experiences the mystery of cause and effect through its daily associations in the mortal world. These associations are experienced through its avatar, the human personality. Through the dramas of life that these avatars or human personalities experience, the sattva creates patterns of merits and demerits for itself. In time, through experience, the sattva comes to appreciate the golden rule that good deeds bring a good harvest, while evil ultimately nullifies itself. What is true of the microcosm is also true of the macrocosm. While the sattva principle is the spiritual seed behind the incarnation of a string of hundreds of physical personalities, the divine self or Vajrasattva principle behind humanity, the human Buddha, is the single spiritual source of all meditating sattvas. So what we're trying to say is the race as a whole is a macrocosm of the individual soul as a unit. So all sattvas are part of one Vajrasattva, divine self. Each human sattva principle is actually an expression on a miniature level of the archetypal creation process that takes place in the world as a whole. These are truths that are ultimately revealed in the deep mysteries of meditation, where in an ultimate state of self-realization, quote, the universe is presented as an intricate interplay of processes, all of which originate in the cosmic Buddha, who causes transitory existence to emerge from his meditation, end quote. In this view, life is a grand experience in which a unity, in the form of a monad, tries to overcome conflict rooted in diversity. The work of evolution is toward the reestablishment of unity within diversity. This process of reunifying diversity involves harmonization. Harmonization is based on the truth that parts are organized within a systemic hierarchy of unities within unity, of individual monads nested within one monad. By learning to participate constructively in the growth of other monadic units around it, parts learn to work with other parts, and gradually diversity is consolidated within unity. Individual parts become bound together, forming unities, which become parts of greater unities until all converge once again in total unity. And that's the end of the section. And once again, that was called the sattva, the monad of the human being. So all selves are part of one self. The next section is called the septenary design of the human soul. And now we're going to be breaking up the idea of the human soul on an individual and a collective level. We've established that it's one thing, and now we're going to talk about how that one thing manifests as a septenary. So each has 7 parts, the individual and the collective, and we're going to look at them as analogs of each other. So that's coming up. All right, next section, the septenary design of the human soul. Because the human soul and world soul bear an analogical resemblance to each other, one being the microcosm, the other the macrocosm, we should expect to find a correspondence between the septenary design of each's inner psychic structure. The world soul as a whole manifests through 7 planes of soul or mind. These are divided into a pattern of 3 and 4. A 3-fold spiritual nature manifests through a 4-fold material form. Likewise, on a smaller scale, the human soul exists across a spectrum of 7 principles, with a 3-fold spiritual entity, the sattva, manifesting through a lower material form comprised of 4 bodies, 3 metaphysical and 1 physical. In terms of the individual human, the 4 lower bodies are divided into a pattern of 1 and 3, with 3 metaphysical bodies reflected down into 1 physical body. These three metaphysical bodies are the mental body, the emotional body, and the vital or astral body, also called the etheric double sometimes. The four bodies exist within the four worlds, each existing as, quote, a sphere of substance, separated from each other by the rates of vibration of their tiny particles. Each of these bodies is centered by its own seed atom or chakra, representing, quote, vortices of force, twisting, spinning, and whirling like a galaxy. Each vortex forms a nucleus around which the four bodies of man are built as he comes into physical incarnation. So these are the seed elements, and they're related to the Platonic solids. Each seed atom or chakra of the body serves, quote, the function of preserving in an unbroken chain and in proper sequence all records of incidents through which the respective bodies have passed. These four seed atoms are called the guardian angels, the cherubim, the four beasts of Ezekiel, the man, the bull, the lion, and the eagle. They are personified in Christianity as the writers of the four Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. They are the lords of the records, the recorders of the life of Christ. That's all Manly Hall. It is the ultimate task of each person's sattva principle to gain complete control over each of these four bodies. Until then, the sattva's lower polarity in the body, the ego principle, retains relative control over these bodies and drives their use towards its own materialistic ends. The relative balance between these four bodies in a person's inner psychic nature leads to the expression within one's personality of four psychic functions. These four bodies expressed as psychic functions are thought, feeling, intuition, and sensation. These correspond to the four elements air, fire, water, and earth. Within each person's psyche, each element may become either dominant or recessive in expression, depending on the degree of development of the seed body underlying each. Manly Hall notes that an overly dominant earth element polarity in the psyche results in the individual who is, quote, content to drift along, seeking only the fulfillment of creature comforts. These types are regarded as sleeping through the days of their years, end quote. Overly watery types become, quote, a slave of the moon and under the tyranny of imagination. They dwell in a private universe of make-believe, which they populate with the progeny of their own wishful thinking. Fire types, by contrast, are, quote, driven by their own emotions, restless, intense, and afflicted with internal conflicts. Their principal purpose is the immediate fulfillment of desires and appetites. Finally, air-dominant types are often, quote, thoughtful and therefore capable of unfolding their mental resources, but are apt to fall into the illusion of intellectual materialism. Advanced members of this classification make good scholars, but those less enlightened become sophisticates, skeptics, or cynics. So those are the four elements as applied to essentially personality types. In the esoteric teachings, it is only by bringing into full expression and perfect mutual balance these four elements together does one gain the capacity to synthesize a fifth body, one composed of the element ether. This etheric body is the home to the sattva principle. The sattva is the threefold spiritual principle that resides over the body, incarnating through it. Unlocking this body requires following the path of Raja Yoga, or the royal path. Manly Hall explains that this path is, quote, open only to those who have faithfully practiced the way of salvation. Here, the alchemy of transmutation is accomplished by secret rules, the most advanced of which have never been revealed to the public. The final instruction is only possible for those who are fully qualified to take the final step. All right, so that was the end of that section. Now we're going to be continuing in this following section. We're going to be continuing to discuss the septenary, but we're going to break it up into now focusing on that idea of the three principles, the higher spiritual principles. And then in the next section, we're going to be zooming in and looking at the four lower material principles. So we're going to be looking at particularly the septenary as it applies to human society, focusing on the three higher principles. So this section is called the Septenary and Human Society, Part 1, 3 above. Within the human species, the macrocosm-microcosm archetype is reproduced internally, meaning that each individual human soul is patterned according to the same archetypal design as mankind collectively. The higher spiritual self for both the individual and collective, i.e. the sattva and vajrasattva, resides in the solar sphere, where it projects its consciousness into material form, residing in the lower terrestrial sphere of the earth. On the individual scale, this projected form becomes a human personality. On the collective scale, it becomes the institutional and organizational superstructure of human civilization. Therefore, the 3 above, 4 below pattern governing the individual human soul is mirrored also within the collective organizational body of world civilization. Meaning that within the inner psychological metastructure of global society, we find the same archetypal principles present as those found at the level of the individual soul. In the case of human society, this septenary pattern is reflected in the relationship between the threefold spiritual hierarchy that together forms the invisible government behind the esoteric schools or mystery schools, and the 4 lower caste levels that together represent the 4 base elements of social alchemy. Investigating first the threefold spiritual seed residing at the heart of civilization, the esoteric schools, we find that its 3 core levels hold a correspondence to the 3 worlds of the soul that we investigated in our previous article, and these correspond to Adi, Buddhi, and Manas. In the teachings of Mahayana Buddhism, the order of beings who reside at the uppermost level of this hierarchy are the Buddhas, the 7 rays. These beings embody the principle of Adi. Bodhisattvas, residing 1 level below, embody the principle of Buddhi. They exist in bodies of pure ether and represent perfected souls from a previous cycle of existence who have returned to offer their auras as vehicles of transmission for the light of the Buddhas to shine into the lesser spheres of creation. Arhats and adepts, who are the terrestrial ambassadors of this great school, embody the 3rd and lowest tier of this hierarchy, representing the principle of Manas. They are overshadowed by the Bodhisattvas and draw their light into the institutional body of the esoteric school, where it is then further disseminated into its body of initiates, disciples, and students. So basically, one becomes a student or disciple or initiate or an adept and climbs the scale or climbs the hierarchy depending on how well they are able to embody the doctrine. So the doctrine actually becomes the agent of change, and then you embody that. And then as you embody it to increasing perfection, you become elevated within the esoteric school. In the Greek teachings, these 3 orders of beings, what we just called the Buddhas, Bodhisattvas, and adepts, these 3 orders of beings are termed A, the gods, B, the demigods, and C, the world heroes. The demigods, like the celestial bodhisattvas of Mahayana Buddhism, are described as, quote, the perpetual attendants of the gods, who are born out of the divine nature to fulfill the will of the gods. These great beings embody the esoteric doctrine to perfection and represent the final evolutionary state that man seeks to attain at the culmination of his evolutionary cycle. The order of world heroes are equivalent to the adept or arhat level of the Buddhist hierarchy. These represent human souls from the present cohort of Earth humanity who have evolved in advance of the rest. In this way, they embody a state of relative perfection in terms of the state of evolution they have developed their souls to. These beings are not the completely evolved souls that the bodhisattvas are, but rather represent more advanced and evolved souls than that achieved by the majority. They might be thought of as the terrestrial equivalent of the celestial bodhisattvas. The Greeks distinguished these 2 orders by sometimes referring to the demigods as essential heroes and the adepts as terrestrial heroes. Pythagoras, Plato, Gautama Buddha, Lao Tzu, Nagarjuna, Francis Bacon, Manly Hall, these are examples of terrestrial heroes. They are not actually divine, but possess divine powers and virtues. Like bodhisattvas, they are born into a mortal state that is below the spiritual level they have earned through their own evolutionary attainment in order that they may benefit less advanced human beings. Together, they form the, quote, golden chain of Homer that binds the higher planes of spiritual existence with lower kingdoms of life residing within the material realm of Earth. These lower kingdoms are the human kingdom, the animal kingdom, the vegetal kingdom, and the mineral kingdom. And again, these all have correspondences in the four elements. Anatomically, the human soul embodies these four kingdoms and elements within its physical structure. So in terms of the four elements, the thought principle within man is associated with air, the element air. Anatomically, this corresponds with the brain. The emotional body is related to man's animal nature and the element of fire. This element is also related to the functioning of the muscular system and its capacity for motion. In the body, this principle of fire is centered in the liver. The vegetal kingdom is embodied in the tree-like organization of the vascular and nervous systems, the former representing the tree of life and the latter the tree of knowledge. Anatomically, this principle, associated with the astral body and the element water, is enthroned within the solar plexus. Finally, the mineral kingdom is embodied within man through his skeletal structure, which provides the material framework within which the higher kingdoms are supported and sustained. In esoteric philosophy, the seat of this element resides not in the skeleton, but actually in the heart. The adept is the individual who has developed, equilibrated, and synthesized these four elements to perfection within his own physical and psychological natures. Only by so doing is one able to detach the rose from the cross, where the sattva principle is able to live permanently within its own etheric nature, from which it may, under the control of its own will, withdraw and extend the physical and psychological elements of a human personality. So when the rose detaches from the cross, the rose can choose to express the lower four elements, or it can consolidate them as the fifth element either. And it has that capacity to do that at will, rather than as part of this involuntary cycle of death and rebirth. So you move beyond that cycle when you can gain control of the processes of that cycle within yourself. So the difference between the human kingdom below and the order of terrestrial heroes existing above is one of evolutionary attainment. In the former, the sattva principle has become an awakened and fully realized instrument of the vajrasattva, or divine self, while in the latter, meaning the collective body of mankind, this capacity of self-awakenedness has not yet been attained. This does not mean it never will, but at this point, the sattvas of humans comprising the majority of the human cohort on Earth are not at a point where they are capable of accomplishing the great alchemical transmutation of their own souls. Until then, nature and the hierarchy are collaborating to elevate and initiate the collective body of mankind so that the souls residing therein will gradually evolve to the point where they are able to become adepts and initiates of the great school and attain that great awakening. Commenting on man's polarization between a superior spiritual core and an inferior material body, Manly Hall points out that, quote, there are two kinds of men. Some are satisfied to remain in their present state, to be human in a world of beasts. Others have verged toward a divine state, and have so lifted themselves to become a new creation, one easily distinguished from ordinary mortals. These are called heroes, representing those among men who, by wisdom, have come to be worthy of veneration. The lower body of mankind is comprised of those souls still young in evolutionary attainment, who have, quote, descended with intemperate passions and appetites, and who lack the virtues of purity. Mankind in this sphere represents the lower material aspect of the human monad, which has not yet been illuminated. Quote, it was to redeem souls of this nature that the terrestrial heroes were born. Hall continues, quote, the heroic soul is the one who has found the law. Through internal communion, he has become a part of the hierarchy of the enlightened, and is thus easily differentiated from ordinary mortals who live in an ordinary state doing ordinary things. The heroes live a life of enlightenment because they are participators with the law. They therefore exist as a race apart. They occupy their own kingdom above the average state of current man, for they are, quote, illumined participators in the divine mystery and are constantly aware of the divine plan, not by belief, but by certain knowledge. In the thinking of the Greeks and Buddhists alike, the adepts or heroes, who again are the terrestrial ambassadors of the spiritual hierarchy, were venerated as an aspect of divinity and were paid homage to, not so much as individuals, but to the truth which shone through them. That's a quote. Hall reminds us that, quote, of the great ones who have lived before, We revere Plato, Pythagoras, Socrates, Buddha, Confucius, Lao Tzu, Zoroaster, and Mohammed, for these were the witnesses of the law. He also explains that, like the Buddhists and others, quote, the Greeks considered it proper to build altars to the heroes and pay homage to them as intercessors between the gods and men. According to Pythagoras, it was appropriate and proper that man should pay homage to the heroes, and the heroes should pay homage to the demigods, and the demigods should honor the gods, and that all these orders of being should pay homage to the ineffable first principle of all being. Collectively, this triadic hierarchy rules over the fourfold lower material body of human civilization. This they do from within their chosen institution, the esoteric school, which is the institution divinely purposed to accomplish the great alchemical work of initiating the human soul into a state of collective enlightenment. So if you haven't picked it up, the esoteric school is the sattva principle of the collective, just as each individual has a sattva principle at the level of their own soul. The collective soul of man incarnates through the esoteric school. As Annie Besant explains, it is the work of this hierarchy to take human souls and, quote, balance, adapt, and correlate them, and thus always keep the world traveling along the straight line, always bringing about the same result, the accomplishment of the will of the Supreme. Their work is ultimately impersonal, since it proceeds according to the exact dictates of law. Quote, they break up forms as well as build them, being always fixated on the one object of serving the evolution of life. Always they work for evolution. Their thought is not fixed on the forms in which the life is contained, but on the life that is evolving within and through them, which can make for itself new forms. When human tragedies occur, quote, it is only the breaking of the forms that happens. The life uprises uninjured and sets free, for the body is the prison house of the evolving life. And if the prison doors were never thrown open, we should be in jail all our lives and make no progress for the future. Thus, we err when we look at death with eyes that are full of tears, with hearts that are breaking. Death is he who brings us to a higher birth, and who sets free the imprisoned soul. It is the liberation of the bird confined within the limits of a cage, enabling it to soar upwards into the heavens, singing as it goes, with joy at the freedom it has recovered. Again, that's an Annie Besant quote. The gods work together as the custodian over the great cycle of human evolution that is taking place within the world's soul. Through the evolution of man, the ultimate purposes of the world's soul are fulfilled. Thus, the gods work, using men as their agents. They bring about national results. Partly, they do it by bringing to birth, at a particular time, men whose individual karma fits them to be the agents of the collective karma of a nation. This is Annie Besant again. She continues, not by chance is a man brought into the world, not by the compulsion of a dead law or of a blind necessity. The gods are working here with an intelligence that foresees and gives, and they choose the accomplishment of their ends, the men whose karma fits them to be agents for the work in hand, and then guides them to take birth at the place where that karma can serve the collective karma of their people. Thus, the devas, or the gods, along with their ambassadors in the solar and terrestrial spheres, quote, bring people together and carry them apart, always for the working out of their individual karmas. Men are guided to places and positions at definite times, according to the circumstances by which, by their karma, they must meet. So that is the role of the hierarchy in human life. So that's the three above the four. So now in the next section, it's called The Septenary in Human Society Part 2, and we're going to be looking at the four elements below. What is this hierarchy ruling over the lower body of mankind? So we're going to be considering the caste system here. All right, The Septenary in Human Society Part 2, and looking at the four elements, or the four caste levels. As we've covered, in the human soul, a septenary pattern is demonstrated in the form of a threefold spiritual principle manifesting through a fourfold material principle. This pattern can be found on both the individual and collective levels. The lower fourfold material form of the collective human soul is embodied in the form of four descending castes, or caste levels, with each caste bearing an analogical association with the four base elements of alchemy, as well as the four seed bodies of esoteric human anatomy. The caste system is therefore archetypal. Over time, it clothes itself in different forms within different cultures, but always it is present as an organizing factor in human affairs. So as I described these four levels of the caste system, see if you can imagine how they manifest in the world today. In what form do we find them in modern civilization? In human society, the highest caste is associated with the element air and was anciently termed the Brahmanic caste. This caste personifies the mental body of the collective soul and is comprised of scholars and sages who preserve and perpetuate the wisdom teachings or dharma, which the upper threefold spiritual hierarchy embodies and reveals to man. In this way, the Brahmins are revealers of the law. They are the outer extension of the hierarchy within the collective body of man. Hall elaborates, the highest caste was that of the Brahmins, originally the priests who officiated at the religious ceremonies and directed both private and public worship. They were the messengers and direct representatives of the gods, and were the custodians and interpreters of the holy law. So that is archetypally the highest of the four caste levels, is that of the sage, the scholar and sage. So that's the Brahmanic caste. Next, let's go into the second tier, which is associated with the element fire, and this is called the warrior caste. The second caste, those below the Brahmins, is known as the warrior caste, anciently called the Kshatriyas, and I'm sure I'm mispronouncing that. The function of this caste is to serve as defenders and protectors of the Brahmins and of the faith. They represent the emotional Shakti of the Brahmin caste and are associated with the element fire. Hall explains that, quote, most of the rulers, princes, and kings of India were of this caste. Gautama Buddha also was born in this caste. In modern times, as world society has developed and complexified over the course of the Piscean Age, this caste has developed a peculiarly complicated history, writes Manly Hall. Quote, the rising power of secular government has sometimes elevated the members of the warrior caste to the highest office and standing. They even dominated the Brahmins, who were required to remain aloof from temporal projects and retain their sovereignty only as keepers of the royal conscience. When the warrior caste overtakes the Brahmin caste, this is equivalent to the emotional body subjugating the mind and its innate reasoning faculties. Here, emotion drives thought toward the gratification of its own desires and impulses. The intellect, by cultivating its innate power of reason, is intended to guide the emotions into constructive and beneficial states of expression. On the scale of society, this is intended to be the function that the Brahmin caste provides for the warrior caste. The Brahmins are therefore intended to serve as the council of elders who commune with the gods to provide the voice of reason and wisdom to the community at large. This offering of wisdom is intended to guide man's collective emotional reflexes, not become victim to them. In modern life, this caste is to be found distributed among a wide body of individuals who occupy key positions within the distributed system of global governance currently being orchestrated out of the military-industrial complex of the United States. Governance, the archetypal social duty of this warrior caste, has evolved into a public-private hybrid. It includes politicians and state bureaucrats on one side, bankers and supranational financial institutions on another, corporate elites and NGOs on a third side, and national security and counterintelligence strategists and operatives on a fourth. As I hinted at in the article that prefaces this book, titled The Ukraine War, The Great Reset and America's Grand Strategy, it is my belief that the Brahmanic caste is currently focused within a secret scientific research institution located at the heart of the American national security state. This inner core is encased and protected by an all-encompassing national security state which extends between both overt and covert and public and private aspects. This expansive governance machine serves collectively as the modern iteration of the warrior caste. This is a hypothesis that I will further develop over the course of this book's remaining chapters. So that concludes my analysis of the second caste, the warrior caste, associated with the element fire. Next up is the aristocracy, associated with the element water. The third caste in the four-tiered social hierarchy belongs to the aristocracy and artisan class, or caste. In ancient India, this group was called the Vaisyas, again, probably mispronouncing that, and was comprised of the bourgeoisie of India, including rich merchants, skilled craftsmen, wealthy landlords, and others who embodied the foundation of the economic and social system. Just as with the current economic and cultural elites we find in modern society, members of this group traditionally held numerous privileges and may attain considerable social dignity. So that's the aristocracy, which is a large class. It's sort of like the upper class, the artisan class also. So the ones who we look at and revere as great cultural figures and heroes, also those who fund the arts. Those come together to form this class. And so the lowest caste is the fourth one, associated with the element earth, and this is really associated with labor or the working classes. In ancient India, the lowest caste, corresponding to the element earth, was termed the Suryas caste. Traditionally, those existing in this caste, which comprises the majority of society, were either laborers, the servants of other castes, or were restricted to other humble occupations. Over the course of modern history, rights and privileges afforded to this group have undergone numerous modifications. Today, this caste incorporates multiple socioeconomic classes and is not composed only of the lower working classes, but also the middle class as well. So basically, the majority of people exist in the working class. And so that's the sort of a caste unto itself. And then a smaller elite is the aristocracy. And then another group of elite form the warrior caste, who are really responsible for the governance. So I guess I would say one is more like cultural leaders and economic sort of leaders in the aristocratic class. And then the warrior class is really about military and defense. And the warrior caste has a monopoly on the use of force. So that's their sort of power. And then the scholars are the thinkers. They embody the thought, the collective thought. So that's the four levels. Now in this next section, we're going to consider the relationship that each individual has in relation to this larger collective structure. So we're going to be considering caste position and reincarnation. And that's coming up. All right, caste position and reincarnation. Reflecting on the four tiers of the caste system, Manly Hall writes that, quote, "It was early taught that the castes originated as four births out of the body of Brahma, the great god. The Brahmins were born from the head of the deity. The Kshatriyas, which is the warrior caste, was born from his shoulders and arms. The Vaisyas, or the aristocratic class, was from his abdomen, and the Sudras, or the labor caste, was from his feet." As this teaching implies, the caste system is intimately related to reincarnation and the long-term evolution of the soul. Hall emphasizes that when it comes to understanding the role that reincarnation plays in determining the status of one's caste position, Buddha attacked the then prevailing attitude that caste was simply a matter of birth. A man was not a Brahmin merely because he was born a Brahmin, but only because he cultivated the highest virtues of the religious life. By implication, man's salvation depends upon the practice of virtues and not upon the exaltation of his class. In this way, caste is differentiated from class. Caste concerns the relative position of the soul, while class concerns the relative position of the personality. Thus, quote, "Salvation was not limited to caste, but depends entirely upon personal integrity." According to this view, all human beings have equal rights insofar as the attainment of merit is concerned, meaning there is potential equality of all men, but this equality is one of opportunity rather than attainment. Hall explains that, quote, "All human beings, regardless of racial background, are composed of identical qualities. That is, they have common endowments, which may be defined as their humanity. These archetypal qualities are the soul's 7 internal powers. These are possessed in common by each human, though each power is not brought into an equal state of expression by each. Instead, they are brought into relative states of expression, with humans differing from one another based on the relative degrees of development of the inner powers they have thus far developed or attained." Extrapolating out from the individual to the collective level, The caste system is an expression of the relative state of soul development present within the collective body of man. Manly Hall explains that, quote, man is attuned to a certain plane of activity by his own nature. His level or caste is determined by his own interests, activities, concepts, beliefs, and abilities. In other words, he imposes his total psychology upon himself. Under such conditions, he has nothing with which to solve problems except the experience gained from these problems themselves. Therefore, in order to advance, the individual must constantly outgrow himself. Every problem must be worked out on its own level. He continues, the conspiracy of faculties and powers within ourselves determines the kind of activity with which we prefer. This is not an arbitrary act of God. It is simply the inevitable urge to be what we desire to be and to do the things which satisfy our own inclinations. For example, quote, by the very act of karma itself, some seem to be born to serve the gods, others to defend the faith, still others to barter and exchange, and lastly, there is the vast majority which must perform the toil of the world. By following the impulses inherent to each of us, we automatically stratify. We arrange ourselves in social patterns. But, quote, because man is superior to all patterns, he must ultimately break through them and continue on his journey toward completeness. According to the overall thinking of esoteric philosophy, we are born as the sum of our own attained consciousness, and we find ourselves where we are because of what we are. All persons must be reborn on the level established by previous attainment. The situations we are born into are not curses but opportunities. Man cannot approach the new except through the old. This is again quoting Manly Hall. He must build upon existing foundations, and the degree of his industry measures his growth. The only problem we will never face again is the one we have solved. For example, quote, human life is punctuated with occurrence patterns. If, for example, due to some short-sightedness or intemperance in ourselves, we have failed to solve a domestic pattern, it is only right and proper that this pattern should continue. It will challenge us in one form or another until it is met by clear insight and vigorous decision. Overall, the four castes are not prisons, rather they are rungs of a ladder which connect heaven and earth. Man ascends the ladder, resting for a time on each of the rungs. This ladder of ascent is the great chakra system of the human monad. God's consciousness through man first ascends and then ultimately reascends this ladder. Behind the whole process is the workings of one life. Hall writes that, quote, as one life vitalizes all groups and classes, it is this life, which is substantially free and equal, that grows through forms, physical, social, or psychological. The internal mechanism by which the one life ensures its own growth is through karma and self-experience. As Manly Hall explains, quote, karma is the law which ensures that this life will ultimately attain all things possible to it. Karma means cause and effect or trial and error. This is the method we, as stubborn, egocentric humans, typically rely on to drive our evolution. Quote, the method is slow, but the end is inevitable. It is man's particular duty as an aspect of the one life to confront and transmute his own karma by, quote, learning his lessons well and embodying the laws governing universal growth. While experience is man's most basic teacher, man also has the capacity to learn through other means. As Manly Hall teaches, quote, it is the privilege of man to anticipate nature in some respects. Through the development of philosophy, he has devised a method for releasing his own potentials. In this light, we understand that philosophy is the method archetypally designed to facilitate our ascent up this ladder. It is intended to anticipate nature and drive the human soul to achieve the ends nature ultimately intends for it ahead of schedule. Through philosophy, the world as a whole is seen as a great schoolhouse of initiation where man learns, grows, and ensures his own evolutionary development. Here, Earth is perceived as a vast school where man is continuously invited to transform latent powers into active potencies. The caste system fits into this overall evolutionary dynamic. Its 4 levels represent stages we all will pass through in our journeys to enlightenment. And that's the end of that section. So the next one is going to be going into now the Buddhist symbolism, revisiting that, but now introducing something that we haven't talked about yet, which is the symbolism of Fudo Mayu. Fudo Mayu. I don't know quite how to describe this name. Fudo is Fudo, and then Mayu is Myo-O. So Fudo Mayu, and he represents the symbol of the dweller on the threshold, which is also the adversary or the shadow. In Jungian terms, it's the shadow. So we're going to be talking about the symbolism of the shadow and the role that that represents in not only philosophy, but also the meditation process. So that's coming up. All right, Fudo Mayo, the symbolism of the shadow. In Buddhist mandalas, one often finds, amidst the serene countenances of its hierarchy of meditating Buddhas, Bodhisattvas, and Arhats, the image of a ferocious-looking deity named Fudo Mayu. Like all aspects of the mandala, Fudo is an extension of the consciousness of Mahavairakana. Quote, although of a ferocious visage, and carrying the sword and noose cord, and his body surrounded by flames, Fudo is a benevolent representation of universal law. Buddhism has no malevolent deity. Punishment is not a spiritual reality. Karma is never represented as an adversary, but is rather part of that power that still works for good while ever scheming ill. Buddhist philosophy does not admit the existence of a principle of evil or of any power of being seeking to frustrate man's search for truth. The only hindrance to man's journey or man's progress is the weakness of human nature, which man must overcome by self-discipline. That's also a Manly Hall quote. Fudo Mayu symbolizes divine protection of esoteric knowledge. He represents a divine power within nature which protects the deepest spiritual secrets from misuse or even discovery by all but those with the purest intentions and greatest sincerity. As the saga of Atlantis demonstrates, the misuse of sacred knowledge inevitably leads man to his own undoing. Therefore, quote, those who would serve their God safely and within the company of immortals must first master their own sins. Simply put, the price of entrance into the temple is the conquest of our own lower natures. Fudo Mayu confronts us as this lower nature. To go into the light, we must first pass this demon. Fudo Mayu represents our undisciplined lower natures and the unredeemed karma that is being expressed therein. Describing the philosophy of karma, Manly Hall teaches that, quote, when the human being, for any reason or under any circumstance, performs an action contrary to virtue, a reaction results. This is not actually a punishment, but a lesson, a revelation of the infinite plan in which all things exist and grow and ultimately attain to perfect enlightenment. Accumulated karma creates a shadow body in our psychic nature. This shadow body is an ever-present obstacle within the soul. It represents the spirit of negation operating within ourselves. In philosophy, this shadow body is often termed a dweller on the threshold. It is like an invisible demon that dwells forever within the psyche. The existence of this demon is self-created. The despotism it symbolizes is actually a mirror of ourselves and our own shortcomings. Fudo personifies an essential lesson that man must learn, that he cannot under any condition escape from the consequences of his own conduct. The dweller is built of the energy we have wasted and misused. That's quoting Manly Hall. It exists as the sum total of perversion, misused force, and perverted talents that we have accumulated within ourselves. Psychologically, these perversions become embodied in the form of a shadow complex. Being energized by negative emotions and thoughts, such as those involved with hate and fear, jealousy and greed, passion and lust, and thoughtlessness and crime, the shadow embodies our negative karma. The dweller is the storehouse of this karma and therefore personifies the repressed shadow elements of our own psychic nature. Overcoming Fudo Mayu requires self-discipline. More specifically, the discipline to live by the law so as to not create new negative karma, thereby feeding Fudo his nutriment. Manly Hall explains that your words, your deeds, and thoughts are within your power, but once they have been precipitated into action, you can no longer control them. They are then subject to immutable and unchangeable law, which is what Fudo symbolizes, the law and its aspect of karmic justice. The ultimate lesson of this symbol is simple. People may do what they will do and what they desire to do, but having done it, they must pay. There is no escape from the reactions of actions. In Jungian terms, Fudo Mayu personifies the soul's confrontation with the shadow, this being a necessary and inevitable part of the soul's internal evolutionary development process. The dweller, as a projection of our own shadow, seeks to awaken us to our own shortcomings, where we have fallen short of the law. Therefore, quote, it is love and not hate that leads Dainichi, or the Supreme Self, to appear as the revengeful power Fudo Mayu. The purpose of evolution is to unfold the internal potential with which every person is endowed. Confronting and overcoming the negative karma the dweller represents is an important aspect of this evolutionary process. The shadow complexes that this adversary personifies are the psychic embodiments of the karma or consequences of our own unwise actions. These shadow elements appear to us in various guises, each a personification of Fudo Mayu. These symbols of our own shortcoming, quote, confront us like accusing judges and bar our way to the light which we will someday recognize and seek to serve. Their appearance may be unpleasant, but the ultimate role they play in the development of our psychic life is constructive and informative. Symbolically, we encounter these shadow elements over the course of our lives through the various symbolic experiences that confront us in both our internal and external lives. Sometimes these symbols come in the form of encounters with highly impactful person or events. Other times they reveal themselves through routine habits or addictions we can't get beyond. Hall elaborates, noting that Fudo Mayu ever tempts through the medium of habit. Consequently, every time we master an unworthy character trait, we pass this dweller. In terms of a direct mystical confrontation, most do not meet this karma body until the time of death. However, in the initiation rites of the mysteries, the disciple is prepared to meet and overcome this shadow entity before death. Manly Hall informs us that, quote, the first great step in ancient initiations was to pass this terrifying monster dwelling at the borderline of the physical and spiritual worlds. The challenge of overcoming him is that of facing, taking on, and transmuting our own negative karma. This is easy in concept, but difficult in practice. As Manly Hall explains, quote, it is not easy to remove negative and destructive thoughts from the mind merely by the will to do so. Here's where the disciplines of philosophy apply. By emphasizing the cultivation of moral and ethical virtues through the heart doctrine and through the study of mandalas and other forms of esoteric teachings, the soul begins to release negative attachments and instead build new patterns around the beauty of the doctrine it is now perceiving. The idea is simple. Through a redirection of the will, the soul can begin to build constructive rather than destructive patterns within itself. Manly Hall explains that there is no injustice except that which results from man's ignorance of the divine plan. Manly Hall explains that, quote, there is no injustice except that which results from man's ignorance of the divine plan. Philosophy is meant to correct this ignorance. Using self-knowledge and self-discipline as its guides, philosophy is about cultivating right action through dedication to right thinking and right living. The method of philosophy is to overcome negative karma first by ceasing to cause it, and second by replacing it with positive karma, which one cultivates through faith, service, and knowledge of the doctrine. Simply put, philosophy teaches that, quote, we should cultivate everything that is good, and the evil will fade away for lack of nutrition. And that's the end of that section. So that's the symbolism of the dweller on the threshold, Fudo Mayu. So now we're going to be keeping going with this idea of the shadow, the psychological idea of the shadow. And this next section is called Using Philosophy to Transcend the Shadow. So we're going to pick up where we left off there at the end. All right, next section, Using Philosophy to Transcend the Shadow. According to the archetypal microcosm-macrocosm dynamic that exists between the individual and collective realms of the human soul, we should expect to find Fudo Mayu, or the dweller, as a relevant psychic factor in the evolutionary unfoldment of not only the individual soul, but also the collective soul of humanity as a whole. Manly Hall teaches that, quote, man's own psychic field is a differentiation from the Earth's field, just as surely as his physical body is derived from the Earth's body. Each individual psyche is a part of this larger collective psychic atmosphere. The dynamics of one impact the latter and vice versa. So the psychic field of the individual is integrated with the psychic field of the earth. In the same way, the sattva is integrated with the larger dynamics of the vajrasattva. This is a part-whole dynamic. Every thought, attitude, and feeling of the person registers as a vibratory motion within this field. Depending on the polarity of the individual, the relationship they have on the overall psychic field can be either constructive or destructive. Out of these dynamics, we find a correspondence in the building of a psychic shadow between the individual and collective levels of the human psyche. An unstable individual contributes to the creation of a, quote, psychic toxin in the magnetic field of the planet itself. These imbalances react back upon humanity, corrupting the psychic processes of others. Quote, the moment the individual lowers the standard of his emotions and thoughts, he is going to come under the influence of this highly contaminated magnetic field. Quote, the average person looking at the world around him is confused by illusionary circumstances or has his cupidity stimulated by spectacles of wealth and luxury. These, taken into the mental and emotional structure, tend to corrupt the nature. When these false values have become parts of character, they emerge again as desires and appetites. The person believing these illusionary pressures to be an expression of his true self may dedicate his life to the gratification of sensory perceptions. Through this process, like attracts like. Quote, as man permits his own collective attitudes to become more and more corrupted, the materials necessary for the building of mental and emotional structures will be less adequate, less pure, and therefore will result in mediocre structures. In this way, a process of entropic negation feeds off itself. So this is all from Manly Hall. As we look out into global society today, we find innumerable blights: poverty, ignorance, superstition, addiction, tribalism, violence, materialism, egotism, greed, lust, selfishness, perversion. Each of these lives as a shadow complex within the collective psychic field of the species. When we as humans allow ourselves to become negative to these influences, these shadow complexes latch onto us and we in turn feed them. In truth, these shadows simply represent patterns of disintegration in space. Quoting Manly Hall now, they are entropic patterns that have been built up through the disintegrative processes of ignorance. Whenever any human becomes even for a moment attendant to them, these shadows take possession of him and he becomes these patterns. Once again, philosophy exists as the solution to the dilemma. It is not only the necessary salve to ensure the progression of the development of the individual soul, it is also the divinely appointed institution dedicated toward guiding the collective past its own cumulative shadow complex. This collective shadow is embodied in unconscious individuals and the organizations they manage and the institutions they govern. These unconscious individuals are possessed by shadow complexes in their own unconscious, ones that are in turn harvested by the greater collective shadow that leers over all. It is these shadow players who act in ways that make this world a hell for themselves and others. This shadow player can be a sexual abuser or an environmentally and socially destructive corporation. Each embody its qualities on varying levels of the human hierarchy. On the collective institutional scale, the collective shadow can manifest as the imperialist and colonialist behavior between nations, extractive and pollutive economic activity by corporations and governments, and illicit financial and economic activity such as that involved with the drug and sex trades and other black markets. Historically speaking, this living manifestation of the collective shadow generally follows the contours of empire. Given that America has been the global hegemon for nearly a century, this shadow is currently projecting its presence globally from within the deep state behind American empire. Or I should say within American empire. Perhaps the perfect representative of the symbol of the shadow within human geopolitics is the idea of the deep state, which references the existence of a permanent covert or shadow aspect of the all-encompassing American military-industrial complex / national security state. This shadow entity extends its reach and influence into nearly all domains of human life: physical, social, economic, political, cultural, and psychological, influencing each according to the spirit of Fudu Mayu, the personification of entropic negation. In truth, the national security state and its branches in finance, capitalism, and the corporatocracy is not the only place where the shadow reveals its ugly presence. Each level of the human soul's fourfold caste system is plagued by it, each in its own way. The four social units or castes are each associated with a particular element, just as each of the four psychic functions of the individual psyche, thought, feeling. The four social units or castes are each associated with a particular element. Likewise, each of the four psychic functions of the individual, thought, feeling, intuition, sensation, are also associated with the four elements. And then the personality types also with the elements. Each caste is archetypally dedicated to the service of one of the 4 elements of the world's soul. Although numerous persons comprise the caste as a whole expresses certain archetypal characteristics unto itself. By implication, the caste as a whole can fall into certain neurotic tendencies. In other words, each develops shadow tendencies specific to its role in the larger social supersystem. So we're going to go one by one now through these. So first, we're going to look at the earth element, and this is associated again with the Sudras caste. The Sudras caste, embodying the earth element through the aspect of labor, can fall into the tendency to go along to get along, as the saying goes, meaning to relax its morals and ethics in order to minimize conflict and just get by. So in other words, to be led like sheep, just to minimize conflict, to go along with the herd. Collectively, this caste can fall into a collective malaise, drifting along, seeking only the fulfillment of creature comforts, sleeping through the days of their years, as Manly Hall says. The prescribed solution for this caste is to cultivate the simple virtues of the philosophic life so as to instill the practice of morals, ethics, and idealism in daily living. This involves cultivating the simple Christian values of doing good works, performing charity, and being of service, even if these are practiced on the simple and immediate scale of one's daily responsibilities, as these relate to himself, his family, and society. So that covers the earth caste, the role of philosophy in transcending the sort of negative tendency of that element. Now let's move on to the water element. So that's the Vaishyas caste. Remember, this is the artisans and aristocracy. So this caste can collectively fall into an introverted neuroticism and egocentrism in which they become, quote, a slave of the moon and under the tyranny of imagination. Considering the psychology of modern celebrity, it is clear that those in this caste can fall into a tendency to, quote, dwell in a private universe of make-believe, which he populates with the progeny of his own wishful thinking. Manly Hall diagnoses the core of this caste's problem while also hinting at the solution. Quote, modern humanism takes the attitude that the universe is an infinite area in which everyone can do as he pleases. The possibility that there are fixed and inevitable rules governing all related things, and even the creative principle itself, forces us to seek security through adjustment with values which somewhere already exist. If there is an all-knowing consciousness in space, and this alone is absolute, then man must attain peace of soul by the acceptance of this principle and its edicts. So as we can see from this quote, the philosophical solution for this caste is to ground the imagination faculties in the body and in the real world of lived experience and natural law. By focusing the mind on the real operations and laws of nature, society, and health, rather than on narcissism and imaginings of its own creation, such as all of those that kind of fantasies that become realized when you become very wealthy, the sort of like extravagant things that you find to waste your money on and to compete with others. So these imaginings, these things are rooted in this lunar principle. So individuals and groups ruled by this element must learn to discipline and control the flow of psychic energy in themselves, and thereby reclaim mental leadership over the body. Overall, the wealth and influence of this caste should be used to bring man closer to nature by cultivating and promoting health in the human body and environment. That's my opinion. That's sort of my conclusion. But anyway, that's the sort of diagnosis of this caste and the shadow element that can drive it to a certain type of neuroticism. So next, let's look at the fire caste. So the fire element and the warrior caste, and this is where we find the deep state and the problems of governance. So it is on this level, that of the warrior or kshatriyas caste, that the problems of geopolitics and global governance emerge. Here we find not only the overt state, but also the covert or deep state, which becomes a powerful destabilizing force in the world. Through it, the collective shadow is given an organizational form and wreaks havoc over the affairs of man. The philosophical solution to this situation is to purify and discipline the emotional drives that impel actors in this group to behave in unethical and socially destructive ways. Through philosophy, members of this caste come to appreciate the meaning of the biblical adage, "Let not my will, but thine be done." When constructive attitudes and beliefs are cultivated, quote, other incompatible thoughts lose their dominating influence. Destructive mental attitudes become dominant because we do not properly emphasize positive and constructive beliefs. We should cultivate everything that is good, and evil will fade away for lack of nutrition. Light does not battle with darkness, for where light is, there cannot be darkness. Where courage and faith light the way of man, fear and doubt can have no existence. That's from Manly Hall. The underlying problem of this caste is that it is not aligned according to a common ideal or vision. As such, there is no shared collective purpose. Instead, knowledge is compartmentalized to the utmost degree within its structure. The confusion of tongues runs rampant, and an environment of competition, mistrust, and tribalism abounds. In this light, each part, not knowing its place within the larger whole, is left to more or less fend for itself and its own interests. This results in the plague of competitive psychology that characterizes our economic, political, and military institutions. Philosophy is the solution to this problem. Through it, those of this elemental type learn to practice the virtues of compassion, mercy, and service. Simply put, by practicing the simple virtues of the heart doctrine, the shadow elements that plague this caste can be quieted and put to rest. So that's how you deal with the shadow, the collective shadow, is that you open the heart, and all the things that we've talked about over the course of the series on Mahayana Buddhism, the heart doctrine, but also the golden mean in that section, the Pythagorean series that we did. Those disciplines and that whole sense of idealism is the solution to the problem, for the reasons I just discussed. So that's dealing with the fire element, and that's the warrior caste. And now finally we get to the air element. So finally, the Brahmin caste, representing thought or manas, and its characteristic element air. This caste has a tendency to fall into, quote, the illusion of intellectual materialism. This description fits the current intellectual class, which ranges from public intellectuals to the deepest level of thinkers, scientists, and strategists working within the innermost recesses of the deep state. At the outer or exoteric level, our scholars and thinkers have fallen into the quasi-religion of scientific materialism, which is more a belief system than a set of scientifically justifiable conclusions. In my opinion, scientific materialism and its leading advocates exist as straw men, propped up to hide the fact that an inner esoteric body of scientists exists behind the deep state, who have been working to develop an entirely different ether-based paradigm of physics and technology for over 100 years. Perhaps even since before the time of Tesla. But even scientists existing at this level, about whom we can merely speculate, may also fall into the tendency of intellectual materialism. If the basis of their knowledge is to design weapons, energy systems, or other forms of technologies whose purpose is to control or manipulate physical matter, then this is knowledge that has become secularized and should therefore be considered profane. Anciently, knowledge was treated as a privilege. Only those who had earned that privilege through initiation were deemed worthy of possessing it. When knowledge became democratized, it also became secularized, disenchanted, and dispirited. When knowledge of the causative world, such as that indicated by research into ether-based physics, which the recent UFO revelations essentially prove is happening, when this type of knowledge, ether-based physics, is secularized, a dangerous situation can arise. The philosophical solution is therefore to re-ensoul knowledge by granting it once again the status of sacredness. Knowledge of cause must come as part of a quest to attain enlightenment, not material domination over the terrestrial sphere. In other words, science must become reintegrated with religion. Through philosophy, this synthesis can take place, and the Brahmin can be liberated from the attachments to false motivations and beliefs. Manly Hall elaborates, to the degree that the individual can become a dedicated servant of those principles which he comes to understand through contemplation and meditation, he is relieved from the burden of self-will and the illusions which arise in his own mind. In sum, by application of the law of analogy, we find that the path of meditation and self-purification pursued by the individual philosopher symbolically also points the way to the path of liberation for the entire species. While the goal of individual meditation is to synthesize the four lower elements into the etheric body of the threefold spiritual principle, the goal of the collective is to do the same, to bring enlightenment to the lower bodies or castes so that all may eventually be synthesized together into the threefold spiritual hierarchy that oversouls the earth humanity. This is the higher threefold principle that we discussed in the previous section. This spiritual hierarchy forms a tremendous commonwealth of purpose, as Mandala puts it. Those who join its ranks become citizens of the eternal. The primary purpose of initiation is to, quote, gain full citizenship in this world, a citizenship which has to be earned. Those who wish to become citizens of the universal have to prove their worth, to prove that they are stronger than the weaknesses which bind them here. So that is the idea of Earth as a schoolhouse of initiation. And so these four castes, these four elements are involved with that great collective process of initiation. So now, finally, we reach the last section of this article and of this whole chapter, and it's called Philosophy's Place in the Mandala of World Civilization. Philosophy is not just about overcoming the forces of entropy and negation within ourselves. It is also about actively building constructive thought patterns, emotional tendencies, interpersonal relationships, and physical habits, routines, and disciplines. Philosophy works as an entire life discipline, one that is premised upon the cultivation of an idealistic worldview that emphasizes a universal perspective on the meaning and purpose of life. Philosophy emphasizes the imperative need for a proper understanding of man's relationship to universal consciousness. Here, one's own growth and development becomes celebrated as the unfoldment of the divine through the human. Through the practice of philosophical disciplines of self-realization, this process of self-awakening of the spirit within the form is quickened. To the philosopher, life becomes ensouled, and egotism is replaced with spiritual humility. Quote, in a receptive mood, one of hopeful expectancy, the individual learns to recognize the symbolism everywhere and always present, but usually obscured by his own opinionism. Receptivity to these eternally existing patterns, these archetypes which reveal the divine will and the universal mind, permits solution to assert itself through us, and thus accomplish its perfect works. In this way, quote, philosophy teaches that the resources of the divine nature are available to man through prayer and meditation, and that inner light can change, rescue, and perfect the objective nature of the personality. In this way, philosophy, quote, teaches that the resources of the divine nature are available to man through prayer and meditation, and that inner light can change, rescue, and perfect the objective character of the personality. As we've covered throughout the various articles of this chapter, the contemplation of mandalas forms an important aspect of these esoteric disciplines. In this article, we've discovered that mandalas do not just exist as occult works of art. The human body is also a mandala, one of the human soul. Nature itself is also a grand mandala, one of the world soul. And human civilization, finally, is also a mandala, one of the human monad, or the manu, the life of the human species, the wholeness that contains the species. Hall elaborates on this correspondence of mandalas. According to esoteric thinking, the world with all its governments is a mandala. It is a huge diagram in which all institutions are recognized as extensions of deity. This vast society of worlds within worlds, of which we are a part, is in turn also pictured as a human body with all its parts and members. Contemplation of these truths emphasizes the ultimate truth that unity is the reality and diversity the illusion. In practice, this unity manifests as a great universal commonwealth of spiritual powers and beings. As a mandala, this spiritual commonwealth embodies the archetype, the supreme seal stamped upon the face of creation. Civilization here on Earth is intended to be patterned according to this same archetype. If we follow its disciplines, philosophy will bring us here as a collective, meaning it will bring us to this state of alignment with archetype, of alignment with law. Through philosophy, principles, ideals, and values must come to rule human life, so that we can produce this vast cosmotheistic commonwealth here on earth. Through this new Atlantis, quote, the lesser and the greater can unite in one magnificent unfoldment of eternal principles. If we can work through philosophy, we can find our proper governments, codes of law, management philosophies, and design methodologies. For all of these things are under one framework of law. So each corporation must be managed as a mandala, or as an expression of law. Unless it is properly and creatively and constructively used, it violates the law and fails. It collapses because it has departed from the integrities essential to its survival. Philosophy must come to govern the way we engage with the world on every scale of life, because if it's not, we become vulnerable to the influence of the shadow. Hall elaborates, wherever any basic pattern is abused, trouble comes in. Wherever we take laws and misapply them, we are confronted with the consequences of our own mistakes. Philosophy will save us from this cycle, one that we are suffering from tremendously as a species and have not yet managed to extricate ourselves from. So only philosophy can do this. The way of philosophy is to move without harm. When mastered, this becomes a type of effortless action, as one surfs alongside the energies of life instead of thrashing against them. In its highest state of expression, through philosophy, one's life motions become a graceful pattern that itself resembles a mandala. Here, quote, all useful labor becomes a spiritual experience and religious ritual. This is a good guide not only for personal conduct, but also as a philosophy of management. Our organizations should be governed as sacred spaces. With this reorientation of perspective that philosophy provides, one no longer lives merely on the surface of daily activities. Instead, one cultivates a, quote, quality of penetration and the direction of those deeper values which abide in a sphere of principles or ideals. This attribute of penetration involves developing the capacity for what Manly Hall calls clairsentience. Quote, this means that the mind enlarges its awareness, gaining a fuller comprehension without any type of obvious phenomena, meaning visualization or type of illuminating type of visuals. So the mind just immediately sort of apperceives things and is able to cognize the elements involved rapidly. So the individual gradually grows better and handles the situations in which he finds himself more effectively. So it's like your intuition becomes enhanced. Through philosophy, life is discovered to be no longer, quote, a struggle against unreality, but instead becomes about the gentle cultivation of the lotus of the soul. This lotus grows through the continuing and continuous realization of our proper places in the divine plan. This discipline underlies all other activity. So the discipline of thinking about your place as a part within the whole becomes the kind of orientation by which all this other philosophic way of life takes place, is you're always understanding yourself as a part within a whole, and you're trying to serve that whole, that greater self. Ultimately, the philosophic life is based upon the effort to establish calmness and peace within the soul and to release it, quote, from any perversions or intemperances by which it could be held in slavery to the physical ambitions. As a part of this process of release, one must confront their own shadow. As Hall explains, quote, if the person resolves to preserve his own internal integrity, he is confronted with many temptations and difficulties. These are personified as the evil beings who try to block his way in the early degrees of the initiation rites. These tempt the initiate to depart from truth and return to his old habits. But if the disciple will stay with the journey and see it to the end, the redeemed human soul returns to the company of the gods and enjoys everlasting bliss. Man is intended to win his battle with the shadow, to overcome the obstacles it presents. For behind the shadow is, quote, the ever-bestowing soul of the universe, who quietly and patiently waits to be accepted. In the end, humanity's quest for growth is not a search, but an inevitable fulfillment, which comes through gentle acceptance of the all-pervading reality. That's Manly Hall again. Propelled forward by this simple philosophic idealism, one grounded in the unshakable belief that one's own evolution is ensured by God, the philosopher approaches the cosmic mystery with, quote, a quiet and serene joy. This is a state of mind we can all aspire to, each on our own level. We can all choose the path of philosophy. And when we do, when we resurrect and revivify the ancient institution of philosophy within our lifeblood, the entire trajectory of world civilization will change forever. And that's the end of this article, World Civilization as a Mandala. I hope you enjoyed it. And check back soon, because I'll be following up this chapter with another chapter on Plato and his vision of the Philosophic Empire. So it's going to be building directly on this material here. So thank you for all of those of you who have gone through this series with me. And I really hope it was beneficial, and I'm really proud of it. So thank you again, and God bless.